Hi, welcome to City Vision's Human Resources course. I'm here again with Angie Kreiner, who is a human resources consultant that has worked with many nonprofits. And in this part, we're going to be giving some refreshers and really some advanced policies and practices and legal issues that nonprofits might encounter. So, Angie, if you want to just go ahead and get started jumping into some of these issues that nonprofits will encounter.
Okay, great. The first slide is more of a refresher, and I'm wanting to talk about this just briefly because we're going to make referrals back to exempt and non-exempt employees several times throughout the course of this session. So as a refresher, there are certain classifications under the Fair Labor Standard Act that all employees must have a designation. They are non-exempt and exempt employees. A non-exempt is an hourly employee. They're required to record and submit all time worked for payment. And the federal overtime law requires that 1.5 times the regular rate of pay must be paid to those non-exempt employees for any time worked over 40 in an established work week. You may recall, or you may already know, that an established work week has to be the same for the entire organization. Departments cannot individually set their own work week for purposes of tracking time. It's got to be the same across the board. I also want to point out that some states have overtime laws that afford more opportunities for overtime to be worked. And so it's important that you pay note of your state law as well. California, for example, requires that employees must be paid overtime for over 8 hours in a day worked and 40 in a week. So it's important to double check with your state. Exempt employees are those who are paid on a salaried basis, a flat salaried basis. Exempt employees also have to meet all of the criteria set forth by the federal and at times the state government. They typically are employees who have the primary responsibility to run the organization or the company. Exempt employees are expected to work whatever hours are necessary in order to accomplish the goals and the deliverables of their exempt position. We covered that pretty in depth at the bachelor's level, and so at this session, I just wanted to refresh. I also want to mention that 1099 independent contractors are not employees. They are independent contractors, independent workers, and the IRS defines really what is necessary in order for someone to be classified as an independent contractor. And again, there are both federal and then some states, California again, for example, recently passed in the last 15 months, a new independent contractor rule. And so it's far more stringent to meet 1099 independent contractor criteria in California than it is in other places. But briefly, there are 3 primary things that they look for, the IRS looks for. It's behavioral control, financial control, and relationship control. Behavioral control is who controls the hours worked, when and where and how often. If an individual, the independent contractor, decides that, then that goes toward independent contractor. If the company decides and mandates presence and certain hours, etc., then it's more likely that that person will not be able to be classified as an independent contractor and will need to be classified as either a non-exempt or an exempt employee. The second is financial, and they describe that really as tools. An independent contractor should truly be the person who provides their own tools, their own laptop, their own vehicle, their own tools literally to maybe perform maintenance or cook. So that is something else that is required. They basically furnish their own workspace. And relational is, again, who gets to really define what is going to be done and when and how that's going to happen. So those are all really critical in defining that. And it's important that those be done correctly. All right, let's talk about some common HR challenges that kind of fall into affecting compensation. And again, wage and hour laws in states are pretty tough laws. For the most part, those laws require the employer to prove that whatever allegation is made is untrue. So they are tougher from a legal perspective to defend. So comp time. We're going to cover all these in more detail, so I'm going to mention them here, and then the following slides will address them in greater detail. We're going to address this one. Comp time is illegal in the private sector, both for private or for profit, and nonprofit organizations. What happens when you have one employee, but they have two different jobs that pay two different rates, but work for the same organization? How about an employee who wants to volunteer to work in addition to their scheduled work time? Can an employer deduct sleep time from an overnight shift? And do I have to give my employees a meal or a break period? And finally, how do I account for room and board? All right, let's tackle the first one. Comp time is actually compensatory time, and it literally refers to the practice of compensating employees with paid time off rather than overtime pay for hours worked over 40 in a work week. Now, it may come as a surprise to some of you that that is a permissive practice in government and public sectors, but it is not a permissive practice in the private sector, whether or not you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. You have to pay them. You cannot just give out time. It gets a little tricky though. Hour for hour comp time in lieu of overtime payment is illegal for I don't even know what that meant, is illegal for non-exempt employees. Andrew, I think I messed up that slide. Hour for hour comp time in lieu of overtime payment is illegal in the private sector. Non-exempt employees who work for private employers, this cannot happen. Okay, so what are your options? What can you do? Well, flex time. Most of you probably have a policy, and if you don't, you probably want to add it to your handbook that says that you do have an option of flex time when it is available, meaning that if either the employer or the employee wishes to request an adjustment to schedule for a period of time, and it will not hinder the ministry or the organization from still operating optimally, then it's a consideration. So you need to limit the employee's hours to 40 a week. But if you end up in a situation where maybe someone has worked 40 hours in Monday through Thursday, you can give the employee Friday off. Employees don't have an entitlement to work that fifth day. If you basically engage them to work 40 hours a week and they've done that by Thursday or by the fourth day of the week, then you can absolutely give them Friday off. That way you maintain budgetary compliance, unless you're in California, because you already owe overtime. If an employee works more than 40 hours in week one of a 2-week pay period, then what you can do again is in that second week, adjust their time, the overtime that was worked, at a rate of time and a half. Because even though in the first week, say for example, they worked 46 hours that first week, you've got to pay 40 straight, you've got to pay 6 hours at overtime, which is actually equivalent to 9 hours of straight time. So the second week, what you would do is reduce the hours worked over the course of that second week by 9 hours. Net net, you will maintain your budget because it will still come out to 80 straight hours, even though you had to pay some overtime because you were able to make the adjustment.
And Andy, just to be clear, it seems like comp time really is only an issue for non-exempt employees because of the overtime pay. If someone's exempt, if they go over their hours, that's just part of built into being salaried, right?
Correct. And I'm glad that you said that. Yes, that's true. Okay. Comp time has really no place. You can give exempts, like if they work extra because you've got a big event, something, and they've been really burning the candle at both ends to deliver on a project, you can say, hey, feel free to go ahead and just take, Monday off. Don't even worry about coming in. You pay exempt employees the exact same salary week after week, period, regardless of how much time they work.
Right. Okay.
One employee, two different jobs for the same employer. An employee may only have one FLSA designation. They can either be exempt or non-exempt. So if somebody has an exempt employee who wants to make a little extra and is applying for a second additional part-time non-exempt job, you can't have both. They can only have one designation. In that case, the exemption status has to be based on the combination of both job duties as if they were one job. Now, if you've got a non-exempt who wants to pick up a second non-exempt, you don't have that issue. It's a non-exempt job. They maintain their non-exempt designation. But if it's an exempt, adding a non-exempt, you have to look at the duties in whole to determine if they meet exempt criteria or not. The basic rate on which you compute the overtime either needs to be the weighted average of the two wages or the rate of the job in which overtime was earned. So now let's say that you've got two non-exempts and one pays, well, they pay different rates. So what you have to do is either do weighted average, and we're going to walk you through that example, or you're going to agree that wherever the overtime is earned on whatever job, that's the rate that you base the time and a half. Now, in order to do that, I want to say you have to do that in advance. So that would really need to be documented in writing that both the employer and the employee agree to that type of calculation for overtime. If you don't, then it becomes potentially problematic. All right, let's look at a weighted average. If an employee works 40 hours in a week at the normal job, which is $10 an hour, and 20 hours in the same week at an extra shift for a job that only pays $7.50 an hour, the employee's pay is calculated as follows. You take $10 an hour times the 40 hours worked plus $7.50, the second rate at 20 hours worked, and you get a total of 400 plus 150 is 550. Then you take 550, divide it by 60 hours, and you get $9.17 an hour, and that is your weighted average. So that becomes by default the quote regular rate by which overtime will now be measured. The employee works 60 hours total. So the 20 hours still has to be now rated at overtime. So you would take 917 times 20, the number of hours worked, and divide it by 2 because it's time and a half. And you get 9170 that's due in overtime in addition to the 550 that is due in the regular rate. So overtime plus the regular weighted average rate or plus the regular rate is what you then get for what is owed. All right, so I just left that there as a reference because every time this comes up, I get a lot of questions about it. And you kind of always have to go back to the drawing board to say, now, wait, what do we do again? So there it is.
Yeah, so you can either pick the weighted average or you can in advance say,
yes,
you know, how it's going to work, but you have to have it written down. So that's great.
Right. You need to really define that in advance. The other reason why you need to define these things in advance, and these do not go in your handbook, by the way, these, you should have an internal standard operational procedures for HR policies and kind of how you make those decisions. The other reason why you want to do that is because when a policy is already defined and you follow it, you protect the organization and yourself from accusations of being biased or discriminatory or unfair. So that's another reason why it's important to do that and to document it.
Okay.
All right. How about an employee who wants to volunteer to work or help out in addition to their scheduled time? And I know that certainly in nonprofits, this is a very common occurrence. And people have big hearts. They love the organization they work for, and they don't want to get paid overtime. They just want to be able to volunteer. So the law is very clear on this. First of all, again, like Andrew pointed out before, if the employee is exempt, there's no problem because again, exempt employees are not paid for the time they work, but they're paid for getting their work, there's a typo, work completed and meeting deliverables. So in this case, an exempt employee can choose to do that and you don't have an issue. If the employee is non-exempt, this is narrowly permitted. So a non-exempt employee is not permitted under law to volunteer in the department or the area that they work. It is permissive to volunteer in a completely separate and unrelated area. So if you have a non-exempt employee who is inputting information from donations, so data entry related to donations to the organization, and it's fourth quarter and they're really busy and they have more work and they really want to finish their batch, but they've already worked their 8 hours for the day. They cannot legally clock out and finish. That is illegal. They have to be paid for that time. But if your donor entry person wants to volunteer to serve dinner on Sundays, that is completely permissive because it is wholly unrelated to their primary job. Sleep, meal, and breaks. Okay, sleep time is primarily regulated. This is a federal law. And what the law says is that if the shift is 24 hours or more, you can deduct 8 hours for sleep time, provided the employee gets at least 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep time. Don't ask me to explain the logic, but that is the law. You cannot do it in just an overnight shift. So if you have someone who works from 10 at night until 8 in the morning, they're not allowed to deduct any time to sleep, even if you let them sleep, because they are still the person who is on shift and expected to respond to anything that happens. So that is the only time you can deduct sleep time, is if a shift is 24 hours or more. And again, we are only talking about non-exempt employees. All right, as to meals and breaks, most people are kind of surprised to know that the federal law doesn't really address meal periods at all. It does address breaks. Meals are really covered at the state level. So what the federal law says is that if employees take breaks less than 20 minutes, then they're compensable. What you need to do is kind of define that. When we were a country that ran on a 3-shift system, and primarily were about manufacturing, this was far more regulated. We now live in a really fluid workspace. And so people essentially are able to take breaks as they are able to do so and need to do so. And they don't clock out for those. But meal periods are pretty specific and they really are run by the state. So it's important that you check with your state. Some will say you have to give an uncompensated 30-minute break if an employee is scheduled to work 5 hours or more, 6 hours or more. There are all kinds of exceptions within those state laws. However, one other constant is that if you have an employee who's on their meal period and they get interrupted or called to do work of any kind, you have to compensate that meal period. So you cannot still call it as uncompensated. So you want to think about that. Like, do you want to permit employees to be able to take lunch at their desk? Or is there a greater likelihood that they're going to get interrupted in doing that? Do you want your staff to take a meal break in the dining room with all of your clients or guests that you serve? If they do that, that's probably not an uninterrupted break. And you may just want to consider compensating them for that so that you don't run into issues. But definitely check on your state. If your state has no law, then you as the individual employer are permitted to establish a policy. And that would mean that you establish it, but you also make sure that it's in the handbook and that it's commonly communicated and known and followed.
Now, Angie, for the exempt versus non-exempt, it seems like if someone is exempt, sleep time is, how does this
Doesn't
apply?
Nope,
Okay,
this
and
is
then
only non-exempt. Everything
same
we
thing with
just,
meals and breaks. Have
right,
you seen
everything
state laws that dictate meals for exempt employees?
no.
No, okay.
Nope, because again, they're not paid attached to time. So all of these things apply only to non-exempt employees. They do not
Yeah.
apply to exempt employees.
Okay.
You are, of course, permitted to say to your exempt staff that, you know, your preference is that they don't take more than an hour or so for some personal lunchtime on a regular basis, just because their presence may be more needed depending on their role. Right. Or unless it's a work-related thing, but there is no application from a legal standpoint, clocking in, clocking out, or mandatory time related to meal and breaks when it comes to exempt employees.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Room and board. Okay, so room and board is also a situation that applies sometimes to nonprofits, especially those that provide housing. There's often people who do live on site. So You may include room and board as part of meeting the minimum wage requirement. Again, only when we're talking about really non-exempt employees, because when we talk about the minimum exempt salary that an exempt employee makes, it has to be cash. It cannot be anything else. That minimum is a cash only minimum for exempt. For non-exempt, you can include room and board as part of meeting the minimum wage requirement, but you have to show that you customarily paid these expenses and that they were for the employee's benefit, not yours, that you told the employee in advance about the deduction from paychecks, so that should be documented, ideally in the offer letter, and the employee voluntarily accepted room and board against minimum wage. And in order to really best ascertain that, you want to take a look at what fair market value is. That should be determined and documented in their file so that they have an awareness of that too. One thing I will encourage you to do is that if you work for an organization that feeds people for free, a soup kitchen, a rescue mission, anything like that, I would not encourage you to include board, which is food, room and board, so kind of food, as part of what you would count against minimum wage, because you feed anyone for free. Now, room is a little bit different. Even though you may house people for free, they're part of a program. And so you are permitted, if you need to include that, you can do it in this way. All right, employer provided housing. There are times when an employer provided housing kind of sits outside of what I just talked about. It doesn't count against the minimum wage per se. Employer provided housing is considered taxable income and must be reported on the W-2. So even if you do count their room or their housing as part of their salary, then you must also report that on the W-2 because it's taxable income, unless one of these three exceptions apply. One is it's for the convenience of the employer. Them living on your property is for your convenience. And that happens sometimes with security or with 24-hour maintenance people. Sometimes there's someone who's in charge of the housing units and they need to be on site because they have to be willing and able to respond at a moment's notice to an emergency or a need. It may also be an exception if it's a temporary work location. So if someone, so say for example, you've got a new employee and you're going to send them to another organization for some training because you want them to get something from that other organization and then bring it back to your organization. If you sent that employee to another organization and they house them for the 4 weeks of training, that is considered a temporary work location or vice versa, and therefore would not be considered taxable income. It's employer provided for the benefit really of the employer. And the last one is lodging is furnished by an educational institution. And that we sometimes see in colleges and universities, that they provide staff housing. And in that case, they get an exception. But unless you are an educational institution, that does not apply.
Now, Angie, I think we covered this elsewhere, but there's also the case where if someone's a minister, there's the ministerial exemption for housing provided.
Right, but that's a different thing because the ministerial exception for housing is the housing allowance. And we may actually talk about this a little bit later.
Okay,
But
yeah, I think it's covered elsewhere, but it's just worth mentioning that
it's
there is another
different.
category. If someone,
Yeah,
generally they have to be ordained or
right, but it's a
somehow,
different thing.
yeah.
This is a regular employee providing
Right.
housing to an employer. The housing allowance permits the minister to deduct their own personal housing.
Right. Yeah, that's
costs.
true. Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
that's
a
a good
different,
point.
it's a slightly
Yeah,
different thing.
yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So here is some continued information, convenience of the employer determination. So there has to be a direct nexus between the furnished housing and the business interests of the employer, kind of like I mentioned, security or someone who lives on site because you have residential housing. Two, it should be required as a condition of employment. So when you advertise the job, And when you hire and you make an offer letter, it should all be inclusive that it's required to live on site. This also happens with camps quite a lot. That's another example of an employer provided housing that certain staff may be required to live on site. It's a convenience to the employer, and it's necessary to the job that they're doing in the business interests of the employer. The housing has to be located on the business premises of the employer. It can't be a house owned by the employer 2 miles away in a neighborhood. It's got to be on the actual premises. If this is met, then there should be documentation and the details, and it should also be in the employee file.
Okay, this is what we were just talking about before. I
Right,
jumped ahead.
right. No, that's okay. It happens. This is such exciting stuff. How can we not? All right, housing or living allowance. And actually, the truth is that the minister's housing allowance permits more than just housing. And so it's also often called a living allowance because it does take into some consideration other housing related things like cable, utilities. Well, cable and utilities covers a lot, water, electric, etc. Ministers are permitted to exclude from taxable income a housing allowance. The amount of the housing allowance has to be submitted by the minister in advance of payment to the board of the nonprofit for approval and inclusion in their minutes. And it has to be done on an annual basis. There are forms that I know that I've developed or used with rescue missions for this. And typically the way they do it is at the annual meeting or in January of each year, they make sure and request again from those individuals on staff who are licensed and ordained ministers and wish to claim a housing allowance. The housing allowance is not in addition to their salary. It is the portion of their salary or income that will not be taxed. So if they are making $60,000 a year and they submit a housing allowance for $24,000 a year, that's a cost that they pay per year for housing, then $24,000 will be broken out into the number of pay periods and will be excluded from the remaining amount that will be taxed and then typically put back together within issuing a paycheck. There's a couple different ways to do it, but some people are confused that a housing allowance is in addition to the income, and it's not. It is the portion of the income that will be set aside and untaxed. Okay, so it's also important to know that this is not really something that an organization approves or doesn't in terms of if that's a valid expense. The onus of responsibility for this is actually on the individual when it comes to taxes. So the organization just has to make sure that if they're going to not tax a portion of income, that they have the documentation that they are required to have in order to demonstrate why they excluded it from taxable income, which is what this process does. The amount of housing allowance is not subject to federal income tax. State income tax depends on the state. Social Security will also depend on the individual and whether they've opted out. Ministers have the option to opt out of Social Security, and that's that fourth bullet. I always suggest that those individual ministers consult with whoever does their taxes or who is their accountant, because once you opt out, it is exceedingly difficult or impossible to ever opt back in. An individual holds all tax liability for making the decision to opt out of Social Security and to submit a housing allowance. If something goes wrong, or if the IRS decides that there was a problem with it, it usually will hit the individual, not the organization, provided the organization followed number 2. So.
Now, Angie, I know there's a number of rescue missions that are classified as a church, and they might have more latitude to count their employees as, because then they could kind of self-ordain. How do you see those? Do they have a larger number of employees that they ordain, or what do you see kind of is
I don't
commonly
see
done?
that they have a larger number that ordain and go through with a housing allowance and or opting out of Social Security. More of my conversations have been with ministers who were advised by another minister to opt out of Social Security, so they took home more money, and down the line really regretted making that decision and tried to
Yeah.
opt back in, which was not very
Yeah.
successful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to make note that the decision to opt out of Social Security is different. Like, it's not really linked to the housing
It's
thing. It's
not
just a
linked to the housing,
ministerial,
right?
special case. But yeah, I mean, that one I would not advise to anyone for the most part,
Yeah,
because
and especially if
you're
you're in
making a decision for the rest of
California.
your life. Yeah.
Yeah, if you opt out of that, especially in California or other states where they have state paid assisted leave or disability, you will be ineligible. Because if
Right.
you don't pay into that through that, you're going to lose out on it.
Yeah.
The ministerial housing allowance, I still will say it's a relatively small percentage of people who do that. If you're formed and filed as a church, again, most of that is going to bounce back on the individual if the IRS or the government determines that there was false information provided or insufficient
Right.
information provided. So
Yeah.
you just really want to walk this circumspectly.
Okay.
Payroll administration, super fun. Now, HR doesn't really own payroll, but in many organizations, it does own payroll. Payroll is kind of that stepchild that sits between HR and finance a lot. But in the best case scenario, I think you've got eyes on from finance and eyes on from HR in order to make a most effective payroll administration. One thing, and I said this earlier, is that established work week has to be the same for the whole organization. And that is how you measure overtime. And that's how you determine when time is submitted and everything else. The other common thing is payroll cycles. Many organizations, nonprofits, I think, defaulted to having 24 pay cycles. They typically will pick the 1st and the 15th, or the 15th and the last day of the month. I have found in practical application that can be a real challenge to effectively administrate and carry out for a couple reasons. When you pick the 1st of the month and the 15th, or the 15th and the last day of the month, those change month to month. And so employees are commonly unclear and uncertain about when they need to turn in their time to be processed for payroll. And the other thing that does is it creates, if the 15th is on a Monday one month, and on a Wednesday another month, and on a Saturday another month, it can really mess with whole work weeks, depending on how you set those up. So I have found over time that when you go to 26 pay periods, which is every other week, so say every other Friday, it's still the same amount of money. It's just issued in 26 instead of 24 paychecks. And so what happens then is if paychecks are issued every other Friday, then the Monday before payroll, everyone turns in their time record. And in that case, then the case I'm referring to commonly, then the established work week is Sunday at midnight until Saturday at 11:59. This ensures that the full week is completed on Saturday, submitted by Monday for payroll issuance on Friday. There are many times when I've been in nonprofits and they are guesstimating when they issue on the 1st and the 15th, and the 15th on a Wednesday, and they're saying, well, just estimate how many hours you're going to work through Friday so we can put that in the paycheck. Well, that ends up causing a lot of problems because inevitably it's not correct. And so they're reissuing the difference, they're making adjustments. It just creates a lot more administrative detail and nightmare. I find that it runs a lot cleaner if you run on 26 pay periods. I will say that there is a handful of rescue missions and other nonprofits that pay every single week. And if you want to do that, that's certainly something that can be done too. The law does not regulate other than to say you have to pay people at least once a month. All right. The other thing with payroll administration is I think it's important to state in your handbook that deductions are made as required or authorized within the paychecks. So required would be things like taxes and garnishments. Some are elected or authorized, health insurance premiums or voluntary deductions like AFLAC or supplemental short-term disability. You should always have an employee sign in order for those deductions to be made when they are elected or authorized. And what about lost or damaged company property? I commonly see things that say, upon separation, if an employee fails to return all company property in the order in which it was issued in the same condition, then deductions will be made from final pay. You got to really pause on that because in most states that's illegal. And in other states, it's not legal or permissive unless that is an agreement up front and the employee signed it. So you want to be real careful before you just deduct things out of paychecks, whether it's a final check or a regular check, and make sure that everything is squared as it needs to be. Final paychecks is also something that's regulated by state, and they regulate quite a lot. Again, I'm going to use California as an example. California says that if you fire or dismiss an employee, you literally have to hand them their paycheck when you fire them. That is the law. The other part of California is that if an employee tenders resignation without advance notice, you have 72 hours to issue final paycheck. It doesn't give you a break for the weekend. It's 72 hours because that way you have at least one full business day to issue that. So you really want to know what your state says about final checks. More states say on the next issued payroll, but there are a solid couple handfuls of states that have more prescribed requirements around final paychecks. And the last thing on here is I get asked a lot about, what about using a payroll processing company? And do you know of anyone who loves their company? I will say a payroll processing company is a good thing. They should be able to really help you track information and free up your staff's time. I will also say that there is not a single company that leaps to the forefront of beloved by clients that I'm familiar with. I think what it boils down to is whoever your account representative is and who's going to provide your customer service. And so when you interview or when you explore using a payroll company, that should really be the basis of your exploration, in addition to making sure that they are familiar and adept enough with your formation, whether or not you're a church or just a 501c3 charitable religious organization or some other form of nonprofit, so that they understand things that apply to you and things that don't. Information management, boy, I think this just hits us all the time. Anyone else feel like the more we have information management, the more we're on information overload? Okay. Well, with HR, of course, like everyone else, we all want to matriculate to electronic files and putting everything, on the computer and making it available on the cloud. And so there's some stuff that goes along with that. There is a growing amount of information and records that organizations have to manage for best practices and legal risk management. And electronic files, insofar as HR is concerned, has to be treated the same as hard files or documentation with regard to security, retention, and destruction. So your personnel files for your employees are required to be kept, if you keep them in hard form, in a locked filing cabinet. Okay, you can't just have them in an unlocked filing cabinet accessible to anybody. They have to be secured. Your medical information has to be kept in a separate file cabinet from your personnel files, and it also has to be locked. That's your greatest level of requirement for security. So if you're going to put your employee files on your computer, you have to have it in a secured and encrypted file that not just anyone can get into. And so you have the same level of responsibility if you move to an electronic file system as opposed to a hard file system. It's really important before you make this move that you sit down and think about all of the policies that need to be established and thought through in order to follow that so that you can ensure the security of the information that you're required to keep. You've got to have a records retention policy. How long are you going to retain records? Now, we're going to talk about this in the forthcoming slides. There's a lot of weigh-in on what that has to be. There are minimums, but you guys will need to also define best practice, what that's going to look like for you as an organization and how you're going to follow that out. Identify what records need to be maintained, how they will be maintained, where they will be maintained, and that all should be in the policy. And then you want to actually follow the rules that you establish within your record retention policy. Again, I've said it before, if you don't follow your own rules, then you're going to run into some serious trouble somewhere in your workplace. It's important for consistency to really stick to those policies. And then define record destruction policies as well. So you need record retention and then record destruction policies, and you've got to follow both of those. And again, that would also involve the when, the how, the where. We'll talk more about that. All right, the other thing you want to think about, because this is all really moving to, well, it crosses into electronic stuff. When it comes to record retention in an email, kind of two things come into play. A lot of companies will limit how much email can remain on their server because they have a limit on how much that can be collectively. And so often companies will regulate and say, you know, you've got to really clean out your email on a daily basis to ensure that at no given time do you hold more than X amount of email or X amount of space within your email. And so you might want to think about that. The other thing is that certain emails will maybe need to be saved by HR or by a manager when key decisions were made. Now, if you don't want to hold it electronically, you can always print it out and put it in the employee file. That feels a little going backward, but that is something that does come into play. And the other thing is that if you ever have an employee or a former employee make an allegation, any kind of legal allegation against you, be expected to know, or be prepared, I should say, sorry, be prepared that you will be told that you can no longer delete any email until that allegation, that legal allegation is resolved. And so there may be times when an organization has to purchase additional storage until they complete whatever litigation or allegation resolution is at hand. All right, personnel files, like I kind of just already mentioned that. You can still keep hard files. You can also keep electronic files so long as they're secured. They cannot be accessible to other people. Same thing with medical information. Those should be double encrypted minimally. You don't want to put them out there on the general Y drive where everyone can find them or get into them. So you really have got to think through with your tech people what makes sense for your organization to ensure that that's all there. I think it's also really important for any employees who process any information that involves record keeping, that they get some record keeping training. One of the other things I actually include in policies that I write when I write a handbook is that employees need to be mindful not to leave things up on their screen or visible on their desk if they are confidential records or documents, that when someone else enters their space, that they need to ensure that the visibility is reduced. Very commonly, HR people, finance people, and others who handle confidential records will get a protector for their screen so that even if someone kind of walks up behind them, they really can't see what's on that screen. You have to be sitting directly in front of it. And those are just things you want to make sure that the employees who handle sensitive or confidential information have an understanding about how to keep it confidential and to keep the records that need to be kept. So again, you want to address server and data storage. You always want to use a confidentiality agreement for any employee who has reason in their regular and primary job to handle sensitive information or proprietary information. I think that there should be a standard confidentiality agreement in the handbook for all employees. There may be some additional for development employees who maybe have access to all of your donors and some other information related to that, as well as financial and so forth. Record retention is actually defined by the Department of Labor, the EEOC, and the IRS. All three of them weigh in on what you've got to keep, how long you've got to keep it. And additionally, you need to check your state again, because those three are all federal, and at the state level, they will also have their own requirements.
Yeah, and from my experience, it seems like there's a lot of points where you might encounter records retention. So if you are audited by the Department of Labor, by the IRS, and Department of Labor could either be federal or state. If you're audited by the EEOC, if there's a complaint against you, any type of lawsuit. And then actually the most common is, I believe, a lot of just standard, your annual audit that you go through. Part of that is reviewing your records retention policy to make sure that it's compliant.
Absolutely. Yeah,
so,
that's very common.
Yeah. Because we had to do this for our own audit. We had to create record keeping policy for that. So, and it looks something like what you're showing here.
Yeah, and I have an asterisk because I really have to stress that this is not a hard and fast list to follow for a couple reasons. If you are in certain states, you're going to have different requirements. And depending on, well, that's the biggest one, is you're going to have different requirements. And this one rounds up to some degree around what you really need to keep and how you have to do it. So for any kind of hiring documents, you've got to keep them for a year. One thing I really suggest that people do is, because so much hiring is now done electronically, and once information comes in, is set up folders within your email, actually, so that as you take care of a job and you hire the job, you date all of those other people within that folder within your email. So a year later, you can just dump the whole folder. And that way you've met that criteria. For basic employee information, it's 4 years upon separation. I-9 forms, again, just a reminder, those cannot be in the personnel file until the employee is no longer employed. That has to be kept separate. And the I-9 forms are either 3 years or 1 year after the employee separates from employment. I honestly don't ever advise that if you have a long-term employee that you get rid of their I-9. In my opinion, it should always be at least, wait till the 1 year after they separate. Because if you ever do get audited for that, you want to make sure you have what you have or what you need. Payroll records are 4 years, and this is largely the IRS regulation, or it's also State Department of Labor and Federal Department of Labor. Tax records are 4 years. Employment actions are 1 year from the date of the action. That includes ADA requests and ADA accommodations, Americans with Disabilities. Job-related illnesses and injuries are 5 years, and that may also have some variance based on your state workers' comp stuff. Request for accommodation, like I said, disability is a year. FMLA paperwork is 3 years. Retirement plan documents are 6 years, and any kind of substance exposure, toxic, bloodborne pathogen is 30 years. That's the big one. So these are some links, and this is one of those areas that you're going to need to do a little digging on, because it's not, let me say it this way, because the Department of Labor, EEOC, IRS, as well as your state are going to set some requirements for record keeping. You can't just look at a single source. And so some of these, the first couple are federal level, like federal retention requirements, some from the DOL. There's a second federal record keeping. And when I grabbed those, they were presented in a pretty good way. They were pretty easy to read rather than just all text. That last one, it addresses what the IRS requires. But it really is important that you consider all of those sources in order to know exactly what applies to you. The other thing that I haven't yet said is that in some of these cases, you have to keep more records or less records depending on how many employees you have and the type of funding you receive. So this is a really sizable area that is worth your time.
Yeah, I mean, one good example, if you ever take a federal or state grant, they're going to have requirements for any sort of audit related to that grant of what you have to have the employee files. And, we had that back, 10 years ago, whenever we still took some government funds. We don't do that anymore. So we don't have to worry about that, but yeah.
Right. All right, let's talk about managing medical leaves. First of all, there are all kinds of, and actually, I should say, let's talk about managing leaves, because there's all kinds of crossover leaves for all kinds of reasons. And this is a real growing area. It's not just medical for the employee, but they're like paid family leaves or unpaid family leaves that are protected, whether or not it's for the employee's own health condition or whether it's for a family member of the employee who needs to take care of them. So we're going to take a look at these in closer detail. We'll go on to the next. There we go. All right. So first, we're going to tackle Americans with Disabilities Act. This applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. This is a federal law. It prohibits discrimination against qualified employees with disabilities in the application process, as well as any kind of hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, training, all terms and conditions and privileges of employment. Essentially, anyone who can perform the essential functions of the job with a reasonable accommodation there is otherwise qualified. They have to be given the same consideration to be able to do the job. An individual with a disability under the law is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having an impairment. I will editorialize here just a little bit with my opinion and say that when they updated the Americans with Disabilities Act, they really went to a degree when they define major life activities or impairment, because it actually gets into some mental health areas or potential mental health areas. And there is literally no way in the process of interviewing for an employer to know that unless the individual chooses to disclose that. In fact, an employer can't ask those questions. It's illegal to ask them in the process of hiring. And so it does create a little bit of a rub, which is why really what they go to, and we're going to talk about this more, is that you have to engage in an interactive process in order to ascertain if an accommodation may be needed. So I just want to put a pin in that for the second and then finish up this slide. A qualified employer applicant with a disability is an individual who, with or without reasonable accommodation, can perform the essential functions of the position in question. The law on purpose leaves some gray areas, and in this case, they were right, because a reasonable accommodation for one employer is not a reasonable accommodation for all employers. For example, many rescue missions are in buildings that are 100 years old in downtown cities throughout the United States. They no longer have working elevators. They're 3 stories tall. And in order for them to put in a working elevator, if that was a requested accommodation so that an employee could get to the 2nd floor because they're physically unable to take the stairs, that would not be a reasonable accommodation. The cost is too prohibitive to many rescue missions or other nonprofits. However, it would be a reasonable accommodation for that rescue mission to put a ramp in place of the steps that would get them into the front door. So that's an example of kind of a reasonable accommodation for one is not a reasonable accommodation for all. Next slide. This applies to both a temporary and a permanent disability. So if you've got an employee who's worked for you for 5 years and they are your maintenance worker and they sustain an injury, even if it's an off-the-job injury, or they have surgery, and for a period of time, they are unable to do all of their duties, and so they're requesting a temporary accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that is something that qualifies for consideration to see if in fact they're eligible for that accommodation on a temporary basis. So many people think that it only applies when there's a permanent disability, but that's not true. It's temporary and permanent. The interactive process, what the law says is that if an employer becomes aware of a potential disability that may need accommodation, then they need to engage in the interactive process with an employee to ascertain if that's the case. So an example would be an employer hires a new employee, and all the examples I give, just so you guys know, are actual examples that have occurred that I personally am aware of or have been consulted on or have witnessed. An employee takes a job, and the job is a property manager at a residential affordable housing unit for a nonprofit organization. And her job is basically 8 to 5. You know, it's primarily as a property manager, coordinating the maintenance and all the other things that need to be done when you take care of a housing unit, or units, plural, in a building. And the employee was arriving to work late and was questioned by her supervisor, and the employee said that she had fibromyalgia. And so she had difficulty some mornings getting up and getting moving, and so getting to work on time. And so she requested an accommodation. And so what they had to do in the interactive process then is to say, okay, well, now that you've made us aware of this, we're going to need a medical certification so that we know what we're looking at. Employers are not doctors, typically, nonprofits. Employees are not doctors, typically. And so it's really important that you provide that employee with that document and have them take it to the doctor so that you get some concrete information from the treating health physician to know how to make those adjustments to the job and whether or not it is reasonable to make that accommodation. In this case, the doctor said that it would be helpful if the individual could come to work a half an hour later so that they had more time when they had a flare-up to be able to get to work. And so the employer went back and said, we'll make this accommodation, but your responsibility is to ensure that you communicate when you have a flare-up through our regular notification policies that you're having a flare-up and you will need that additional half hour to get to work. So that was the reasonable accommodation. Over time, and I'm going to take a minute on this because I think it's a good illustration of commonly what can occur. Over time, that employee continued to be late, later than the half-hour grace on a very regular basis. And so the supervisor addressed it, and the employee said, well, I have an accommodation. And the supervisor reminded the employee that that accommodation was in place when there was a flare-up. It was the employee's responsibility to notify the employer of the flare-up. And even with the half-hour grace, the employee was still late. That employee ended up getting fired because the employee just wasn't there and still did not follow the required protocols that the employer had in place for policy. And so I say that because there's a lot of concern that when you grant a reasonable accommodation, that it's a completely hands-off situation where you still can't hold an employee accountable to do the job, and that's wrong. The Americans with Disabilities Act still requires and asserts that the individual employee has to be able to do the essential functions of the job and is able to do it with the accommodation. It doesn't mean that an employer cannot still hold the employee accountable. And that's a really critical piece to navigate and to discuss and document with the employee. So I've not only hit interactive process, I also hit reasonable accommodation. And what you end up with is if an employee cannot meet the required duties of the job, then you end up with an undue hardship. That's one way you can end up with an undue hardship because you have to have that job done. Another way is that if they evaluate and come back and say, and I've had this happen, a receptionist at a rescue mission said that she could no longer lift the tray of mail anymore. And so she needed a reasonable accommodation. Well, what came from that is that it wasn't reasonable to continue to employ this person full time when now a percentage of her job had to be done by someone else. And so what they said is the accommodation is we can reduce your hours by X amount because we have to pay someone else to do the part of the job that you can no longer do. And at some point they could have declined that because that would have been a hardship. The ADA certification and paperwork, again, you want to provide a form to the employee to provide to the physician. And you want to also make sure that the employee provides their job description, give it to the employee to give to the physician. I cannot stress enough how critical it is that those job descriptions are up to date, especially with physical factors and working conditions, so that a treating physician understands the context in which the employee works. I'll give you a common example. Worked with folks who are getting cancer treatment, but they work on the front lines of homeless intake. And it's really important for the treating physician to understand that, because as the employee may have intermittent time off to receive cancer treatment, their immune system becomes increasingly unable to ward off illness, and that poses a great threat to them. So it's important that the job description is sufficient so that a treating physician can make their best recommendations, whether it's Americans with Disabilities Act or family medical leave. You've got to really make sure that that's provided. The Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't have a hard return date on when that must be returned, but what they have done is kind of benchmark to what is reasonable, and there has been some case findings or some court findings that say reasonable is within 30 days. So I have seen in my time where people try to kick the can down the road and not return paperwork, believing that it will extend their employment. So I think it's real important that when you give it to them to provide to their physician, that it include on there that it has to be completed and returned within 30 days. Oh, I do want to say one thing. In order to get the ADA paperwork or certification, if you're familiar with Ask Jan, J-A-N, it's the Job Advice Network, I think, but it's jan.com or jan.org. They have a good form, and you can also Google it within the Department of Labor, also has a good base template form for you to use for that certification. State and local leaves. Boy, this is really on the rise. There are a number of states that are now adding paid sick time. In fact, as you see there's 21 state or local entities that now mandate and require that employers provide all employees with some form of paid sick time. The second is paid and unpaid family and or medical leave. There are 34 states plus DC that provide some type of this leave. And this is over and above what you may provide for your people in vacation or PTO or sick or personal. And then the third one is an emergency public health leave. And this is newer. Colorado passed in the last year, an emergency public health leave. It kind of created for them a PIN after dealing with COVID. And actually COVID's not on this list because at the point of this recording, all forms of mandated COVID or optional but reimbursable COVID provided leave have come to an end. Most of those, all of those ended on September 30th. And so right now what we're seeing is entities beginning to say, we're probably going to have other similar things come our way. And they're kind of putting a pin in it so that the government, in this case, the state of Colorado, can say when there is a declared public health emergency, then there will be some leave that must also be granted to all employees for that public health leave. And it's usually a one and done for a single incident or issue. Also, there's domestic violence and crime victim leaves, and these leaves are increasing. There are some at a federal level that basically say that you cannot retaliate for someone who is the victim of violent crime or domestic violence if they need to take time off. It doesn't have to be paid, but they need to be able to take time off to file police reports or get restraining orders or testify in court without fear of job loss. So that's something else you definitely want to check with your state. It's critical to know which laws exist and what applies to you and how they interplay with other legally mandated leaves. What begins to happen is you end up, depending on how many employees you have, with stacked leaves. So if you have 50 or more employees, then family medical leave is a federal law that requires up to 12 weeks of unpaid but job protected and benefit continued leave. Now, those will often be stacked with whatever you have for accrued time off. Most employers write their policies that all accrued and available time off, vacation and sick, have to be taken concurrently with FMLA leave. If your state also has paid family leave, for example, or disability leave, or personal medical leave, you may also you need to check if the state law limits stacking it under federal law. And if it does not, then you need to put it in your policy that those leaves will run concurrently. Also, interestingly enough, a lot of the state paid leave laws don't have a job protection component to it, but many of them do have a partial income replacement. So by stacking leaves, by putting them all concurrently rather, you limit the total amount of time to a degree that an employee can be out of work and have job protection. So it's important to know that. And I basically just covered number 2, mandatory or optional to run concurrent with other leave.
Yeah.
There are some cases, oh, I'm sorry, Andrew, you have a question?
I was just going to say, for students who are in this course, one of the assignments we have is to look up all these laws for your state. The NOLO book that we use has a list of some potential links you can use. But part of what you should be doing is taking notes and saying, for my state, type in, employee leave laws for whatever your state name is, and then you can find the latest information. Now, you should be sure if you're looking on websites, you don't look at a website that, was posted 10 years ago, because it's probably going to be out of date. NOLO has, is one of the key sources. There's a few others that, try to keep up to date information. But I know this can be complicated, but that's something I would encourage, our students to do, is to search for those online. So.
Yeah, that's great. And in fact, if you can see at the bottom, I reference, I put down the NOLO, one of the NOLO links. They are really good. The other thing you want to do is go to your state website. That should have it on there too. So, okay, great. And then some of them I've recently seen, there's a few recent pieces of state legislation that say the employee, and I think Washington state is like this, and that's a brand new, and it is the most generous leave that was ironically instituted 1/1/20, and they give 12 weeks of partially income replacement at 90%. Boy, they did not know COVID was coming. But they also say that it's up to the employee to supplement the difference out of accrued leave, or whether or not they don't want to have to use it, in which case they can stack leaves end to end and end up with a lot more time away from work. So you really want to take a look at those. That's a great homework assignment. I promise it'll serve you either as an employee or someone who administrates these things, and certainly as an employer. So pertaining to all leaves, you really have got to verify the applicable law. Like Andrew said, check the year, make sure you've got current, and make sure your source is reliable. Don't just look at news reports. As well-meaning as they are, they often don't have the correct information. You really want to read all the fine print, make sure you source it well, and that you verify that it actually applies to you. There are many cases where there's an exception for churches. There are times when there's an exception to nonprofits, and then other times there are no such exceptions. So California, one of the big ones, and people still don't seem to really know about this. I'm going to mention this briefly. CFRA is the California Family Leave Act that runs kind of parallel to FMLA. And for years, it was only applicable to employers who had 50 or more employees. Effective 1/1/20, they made it applicable to all employers in California with 5 or more employees. And so that is one of those things that for years, small businesses didn't think about it, didn't worry about it. And I'm really surprised at the number of those smaller businesses and organizations that still don't know that it applies to them, and it absolutely does. So then what you do is, once you figure out the laws that applies, you've got to take a look at your existing policies and make sure that they are compliant with the laws that apply to you, and that they provide you with the operational choices and administrative choices that you do have as you want them to occur. So I'll give you a quick example. FMLA says you get up to 12 weeks off in any 12-month period. So that means the employer gets to determine how those 12 weeks of leave are measured. The most common one is a rolling back measure from the date that leave would be taken. So if leave is going to start October 15th, I would look backward 12 months to see if that employee has used any other leave, so that that employee knows how much leave is available to them at that time. If you do it on a calendar, then you need to realize that it's possible for employees to stack 12 weeks at the end of 1 year and immediately take another 12 weeks at the beginning of the next year, which would give them 26 weeks or 6 months off. So you really want to think through the choices that you do have, how you want that to work. And then you've got to be really intentional and proactive in your communication. Many of these leaves require certain notifications. Some require that you put it in your handbook. Some require that you put it in your handbook and post the notice. Some require that you hold a training. Some require, so you've really got to be consistent about how you communicate what applies. And the fourth thing on there, I'm sorry about that, is be consistent then in how they're administered. You know, if you're going to get a medical certification when it's the employee's own health condition, unless it's obvious, as in pregnancy, then you need to do it across the board all the time. You got to be consistent. You've got to document everything, and you've got to follow what applies and follow your policies. All right, marijuana in the workplace. This is another area that's growing by leaps and bounds incrementally. The current legal status at the time of this recording is that marijuana is now medically legal in 36 states, including, and in addition, in DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. So those territories as well. They've all approved comprehensive, publicly available medical marijuana or cannabis programs. It's recreationally legal in 21 states. I'm sorry, it's recreationally legal in 18 states for people who are 21 years of age or older, and in the District of Columbia, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam. There's another 13 states in the US Virgin Islands that have decriminalized its use. So the courts just aren't going to deal with it if there's an arrest or whatever. It is still illegal under federal law and is still classified as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act. I did read a couple news reports this week that it's gone to a House committee, and they're trying to get some traction to make it decriminalized and no longer illegal under federal law, but that has not yet happened. At a minimum, when you look at your drug and alcohol policy, you want to address these things. You want to prohibit the use, possession, sale, distribution, or manufacture of controlled substances. If you have a zero tolerance, you need to say you have a zero tolerance for possession, use, sale, distribution, manufacture, etc. on your properties. You want to qualify what that is. Is that on your property? Is that in your vehicle? Is that at organization-sponsored events? You need to be clear and thorough in that. You want to forbid employees from reporting to work while under the influence. There can be no impairment of any kind. Even if it's a prescribed substance, you want to require employees to report it before working if they're taking any medication, even prescribed medication that can cause impairment. This is most commonly missed when it comes to visiting the dentist and having dental work. A lot of people forget that they are given some pretty strong substances that and it does cause some impairment. So you want to require that the employees have to report it before returning back to engaged work, if that's the case. In some cases, you're going to make a decision to just send them home because it doesn't make sense to have someone on the job and be impaired even the tiniest amount. Reserve the right to conduct searches of the workspace upon reasonable suspicion. That should be in your policy. Determine and communicate what your testing is. And I've got to say, and this goes with the last one, ensure compliance with applicable federal and state law. Every state is not permitted to conduct random drug tests. That is not allowed in all 50 states. And so you really need to take a look at what applies to you and then note that in your policy. Oh, one quick thing, and I know I said it in the other thing. If you suspect an individual is at work under the influence and you want them to be tested, do not let them drive themselves to be tested. You need to transport them or put them in an Uber to be tested. Do not let them drive themselves if you have suspicion that they are currently under the influence. Next slide. All right. I'm going to just say one more thing about alcohol and drug policy stuff again. Sorry about that. But the other thing I wanted to say is that a lot of places who do drug testing on their clients also think it's perfectly acceptable to drug or alcohol test their employees. That is definitely not best practice. And in many cases, it's not even permitted or defensible. You really need to send them to an independent test location when it's an employee. First of all, you don't want employees who aren't HR handling, unless you've got a full medical entity or unit there. But you don't want just people who routinely test clients to be testing employees. That is a huge problem from a number of different perspectives. Employees shouldn't have access or knowledge of other employees. That is inappropriate. It violates all kinds of employee privacy when you do that with another employee. And it can also be construed as no real chain of custody protection. So I just want to say that because I've seen that go wrong a couple of times, and you just need to make sure that you check out not only what your state says, but then with best practice. They're not going to regulate that you transport, but you should transport if there's reasonable suspicion. And really, you need to get your employees tested, not how you test your clients. You need to get that done correctly and offsite. Okay. Training. This is another thing we're seeing and that you've really got to drill into, and that is that there's a number of growing mandated trainings that are happening by cities or entities or states. And then there's also best practice training. Best practice training in the first 3 areas, and especially in the first 2 on this list, even if it's not mandated in your state, but you still do regular sexual harassment training and anti-sexual harassment training and anti-harassment and discrimination training. If you ever end up in a lawsuit, it will absolutely go to your favor that you conduct and do these trainings on a regular basis, because it demonstrates that you have been proactive and that you have a more educated workforce. In many states now, it's mandated. Both anti-sexual harassment and anti-harassment training is mandated in, I want to say, about 9 states right now, some form or another. Safety training is another area that should be conducted. Now, again, depending on your funding, you may have some additional safety training when it comes to driving, depending on your funding and depending on what people are driving. So you want to check into that. Back to the harassment and discrimination training, you really want 2 levels. You want general employee, and then you want supervisorial, because there's some additional information that supervisors should receive over and above what employees receive. So I know off the top of my head that California, New York, I want to say Illinois, Connecticut, I think Rhode Island. There's a number of them that have these mandated trainings now, so it's important to know. Safety training, the other thing I think you should really think through is for every job at your organization, what are the safety concerns or awarenesses that you want and need employees to have mindfulness of? And I would really encourage you to build that into the onboarding in the first couple of weeks on the job, and then periodic updates and reviews for training for that area in the workplace. For example, if you're in shelter, one of the things I see that's important on training is that no one wear jewelry that could actually be used to harm an employee. So if they wear long and chunky necklaces in a crisis shelter where you've got a more unstable population, that could become a choking hazard. And so I've seen several shelters just really train their employees that you don't want to wear dangling earrings, you don't want to wear big jewelry that can, be used to actually inflict harm on you. Earbuds is another thing I see a lot in certain positions in the warehouse. While driving, you cannot have earbuds in both ears. Those are things you want to think through, that for every department, every division, what are those protocols? And is the safety not just about the actual job function, but perhaps the building they're in? Are there alarm codes? Are there protocols to leaving after dark in pairs? You really want to think through those things and begin to set that up for your employee group. And supervisor training in general, I cannot stress how important this is and how often overlooked it is. I think that a lot of nonprofits, because we are never overstaffed, live by the opinion that if you've already been an employee and you get promoted to supervisor, you already know us, so you already know what to do. And that is a false philosophy. Provide your supervisors with training. Let them know what they have to do, how to approve time cards, how to approve time off, how to schedule around the holidays so that everyone gets to spend some time with their families. What policies do they need to be aware of that they're now responsible to actually enforce and uphold? So don't negate new supervisory training and then ongoing supervisory training. Those are really critical things. And the other thing that you want to think about when you think through supervisory training is what things do they need to handle, or are they empowered to handle and should handle on their own, versus what do they need to run up the chain of command? Any medical related stuff, they need to refer over to HR. Any time off that might be a protected leave, they need to let their VP know, or they need to let HR know, because we don't want supervisors making decisions that bind an organization in a manner that doesn't afford an employee something that they're legally entitled to under law.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, Angie, this has been great. And one tool that we provide to help train supervisors is we provide this course for free on our City Vision Institute website. So if you're taking this course, you can share this with others. We're going to have this talk in week 8, and you can use this as one of the tools. One other thing I just want to say, for those of you who you may be in a small organization, you're completely overwhelmed by all of this. Usually how you kind of build up these policies, you do a bunch of research locally. You might hire a consultant that's going to help you create a policy manual. That's a lot of what Angie does. Recognize that some of the most complex things, and as you do your research, you'll find that some of the most complex things don't apply or may not apply to smaller organizations. So, but don't always assume that until you've done your research. So, Angie, I just want to thank you for sharing this. This has been extremely helpful, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me to do so.